Peace be upon you and God's mercy and blessings. We will talk, God willing, about this topic, which is one of the types I rely on in the key appointments, the mirror key appointments, the mirror key appointments. I know. A type of pathology that is dependent on blood supply, which means that if I have a tumor in the brain, in one way or another, I have a tumor in the brain. When a tumor needs to engage in something called angiogenesis, which is the idea of having a network of arteries that nourish the tumor itself, it consequently requires more blood supply than the surrounding tissue. Angiogenesis is a crucial process in tumor development, where the tumor actively engages in creating a new network of blood vessels. This network of arteries is essential for providing the necessary nutrients and oxygen to the tumor, allowing it to grow and thrive. Therefore, its perfusion differs if you read this tumor compared to the rest of the surrounding tissue, as the area is higher than the rest of the surrounding tissue. As a result, the tumor demands a significantly higher blood supply compared to the surrounding normal tissue. This increased perfusion can be detected when analyzing the tumor, as it shows a distinct difference in blood flow compared to the surrounding tissue. The area of the tumor, therefore, exhibits a higher perfusion rate than the rest of the surrounding tissue, indicating its unique vascular needs. In fact, knowing the perfusion, or knowing that you are the blood supply or the angiogenesis of this tumor, helps you determine the grade of the tumor. This tumor can be of any grade exactly. So, I want to implement a technique in MRI that focuses on this area and starts to detect the difference in perfusion between different tissues. We will begin by using contrast media. As you know, if we use contrast media, it is considered to be gadolinium. As we discussed, this gadolinium has unbound electrons. You know, if we perhaps we might want to consider simply using, or maybe even the amber electron, as we discussed before, changes the field, or the homogeneity in the magnetic field. So today, when I want the contrast agent to be very fast, it should take about 20-25 seconds to reach from the injection site to the heart or the brain if I have a flow rate of 5 milliliters per second. The contrast agent will reach the brain, and I prefer a flow rate of 5 milliliters per second. How long does it take to reach the brain? For example, about 20 to 25 residents, the time for the contrast is very fast. This is a point you need to keep in mind. So, when the contrast goes to the tissue and reaches a specific focus, what does it do? It was mentioned before that the contrast does two things. It reduces the T1 constant and reduces the T2 constant and T2 star constant. What does this mean? It means that the magnetization recovery occurs in a shorter time, and the decay of the transverse magnetization, which I call T2, or if I'm not talking about the spin echo sequence, but rather the gradient sequence, then T2 star constant, or T2 constant for the tissue, will be fast. So it reduces T1 and T2. Why does it do this? Because the contrast simply causes inhomogeneity in the magnetic field due to the presence of free electrons. Each electron in its magnetic field starts to cause the protons that you excited with the RF pulse, and that came down from the LM to experience rapid dephasing of the transverse magnetization. Consequently, the recovery of the LM in the Z direction becomes fast, and the decay of the transverse magnetization becomes fast. So the L, the one who is German, is following the path of the Z. The Z, the Z, the Z, the Z, the Z, the Z, the Z. Transfer militarization remains. The transfer return of the transfer remains fast. And the recovery of T, which is related to T1 constant, will be fast. What does this mean? It means that you If I am talking about the T1 sequence, when I take a T1 weighted image and a T2 star weighted image, I observe the change in signal intensity with my contrast agent. Let's assume I have this tissue without any contrast agent and the same tissue after applying the contrast agent. What will happen to the signal intensity for T1? And what will happen to the signal intensity for T2? If I am discussing T1, and assuming I am talking about a specific tissue without any contrast at all, its recovery will be different. After applying the contrast agent, its recovery will be faster. This means that at a certain point in time, if you record, you will find that the signal I receive is from gadolinium, and the contrast, and so on. The signal that comes from the operation without contrast has a lower intensity. This is what we do in cases of T1 weighted image, where we did not use contrast. However, when you take a long time, in high-resolution T1 weighted image, like in spin echo imaging, in the first pass, you want to see the blood flow, which is referred to as the first pass. This means that my contrast agent is still moving through the microvessels present, and you want to observe its blood flow or perfusion within the tissue to differentiate the blood supply between the differentiation present in the brain or whatever organ you are working on. Well, I need a fast sequence. I need a fast sequence because this topic will analyze this issue, and you get a fast sequence because you are talking in seconds, and it maximizes the difference, which is shown by the gradient echo. There is a specific type of gradient echo called echoplanar imaging, or echoplanar imaging, which we will talk about a little. We established the relationship of the T1 weighted image with T2 star weighted image. You will find that air without contrast decreases normally over time. In the previous injection, there was a division in T2. If you come to record the signal, you will find that the signal coming from without contrast is higher than the signal coming with contrast. So, in the case of without contrast, was the signal intensity high or higher than the signal intensity of your with contrast? So, what did the presence of gadolinium do? It gave me a higher signal intensity in T1 and a lower signal intensity in T2, or T2 star. Now you have signal intensity in 82 or 82. In the brain, and in a specific voxel, and in a certain tumor, the pressure was easily controlled. Let's see the relationship between signal intensity and time. Suppose you are performing an ingredient echo sequence that takes an image of this area or this slab or this voxel every 1 second. Before the exam, the signal was very normal like this. I want to give you a baseline for the signal intensity of the 3 T1 weighted images. What happens when the contrast agent first enters your voxel? There is a loss in signal intensity, and then what happens to the contrast agent? It starts to exit from that voxel and moves along your pathway, continuing along your pathway, which causes your signal to increase and begin to return to your baseline. The amount of loss that occurred is related to the degree of perfusion in the area, which is higher compared to the other tissues present. So, the higher the perfusion in that area, the greater the loss. In comparison, it relates to the other tissues that are present. Well, if the contrast agent is slightly lost, the signal intensity will decrease by a lesser amount, Let's say I have an image like this, and I have a voxel here and a voxel here. Okay, and let's compare the signal intensity with two pieces. It's better to place a voxel. This is the hyperfused voxel, and that is the low perfusion voxel. We will call the first voxel 1 and the second voxel 2. What will happen? Hyperperfusion will occur and the parameter will drop significantly. The drop will be like this. Why is there a loss of signal? Because the amount of the contrast agent that reaches the voxel with low perfusion will be low, and thus the diffusing will be minimal, leading to a small loss of signal. This is if we are talking about my signal of interest, T2 star, and the opposite is true for T1. So, what do you call this? I call this the hemodynamic sequences. So, a dynamic substability contrast sequence, DSC, means that I take a series of rapid images. Here we have resident 1, resident 2, resident 3, resident 4, and so on, reaching up to about 20 residents, and so on. Imagine the same voxel. Then, you create a trace for the voxel on all these images, and it draws this curve for you. From this, you derive some functions like the time to peak, which means the time from the beginning until it reaches the peak. This is the time you should have. The width essentially represents the mean transit time, which is the time the contrast agent remains within the tissue. Or you can integrate the loss of the entire signal and calculate something called cerebral blood volume. From this entire area, you can see how much volume it has and the size of this cavity. It gives you your cerebral blood volume, and all these parameters are useful for the topic of diagnosis and assist us in the diagnostic process. This is perfusion explained very simply. This is perfusion explained very simply when we talk about it. As we see here, this voxel is with a stronger voxel, and this voxel is with a stronger voxel. The signal intensity here is high. The voxel with the stronger voxel remains weak, while this voxel with the stronger voxel has a signal intensity that reaches this area. The voxel with the stronger voxel that reach this area is low. The voxel with the stronger voxel that reach this area is low. The voxel with the stronger voxel that reach this area is low. The signal intensity will remain higher with hyperperfusion than with the hyperfused. I apologize, it remains higher than the As you can see here, imaging was performed using imaging before, imaging after. Imaging was performed using imaging. Imaging was performed, imaging was performed, imaging was performed. He intervened, and it started to feel like a text in prison. As you can see, the prison became all about that. After that, what didn't happen strongly in prison began to return again. In your T2 image, it starts calculating the weights, which is the mean transit time, the time it takes to reach the peak. If you integrate over this entire area, it begins to calculate the cerebral blood volume for that area. Of course, you can choose this for any voxel present in any region, anywhere you observe or doubt, and it starts calculating according to the images you have taken. This happens through gradient eco-imaging using a fast sequence called echoplanar imaging. The idea of this sequence is that you give a 90-degree pulse, and after the 90-degree pulse, you provide a set of gradients instead of giving a 180-degree slice selection gradient. The imaging process in this context is a multi-step procedure, each step being vital to the overall success of the imaging. Initially, slice selection is performed, which isolates a specific section of the subject. This is done by applying a gradient field, allowing precise targeting of a particular slice. Next, phase coding is used to encode spatial information into the signal, which is crucial for image reconstruction. This involves additional gradients that control the signal's phase. Following this, frequency coding is applied, which differentiates signals from various locations within the slice. By using a frequency gradient, signals are separated based on frequency, resulting in a clear image. The process starts with a set of gradients, each calibrated for the desired effect. As each gradient is applied, an image forms gradually. This is similar to drawing a sphere, where each 90-degree gradient application adds detail, leading to a complete representation. The 90-degree addition refers to incremental steps, refining slice selection, ensuring precision in the final image. Wide phase including gradient, wide frequency including gradient, frequency including gradient. When you come to be examined, what should I do here? An image is taken here, an image is taken. If you are adjusting the gradient, and each time you take an image for the sequence, what is the benefit of this story? It allows you to work with the protons that are present. Then you perform the aggregation again, and 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 then you perform the aggregation again while you are doing your work. So you utilize the neutrons and the interaction of your setup. So when it goes down like this, what are you doing? No, you are doing rewinding, meaning this gradient is rewinding the protons. So instead of the curve being like this, you made it like this. With each peak, you capture an image. However, if this exceeds a certain limit, it can cause significant signal loss and introduce artifacts. This is one of the very fast examinations with many applications. Echoplanar. Imaging can be used in the T in the spin echo sequence, meaning you use 90 and 180 degrees, and after 180, you use a set of gradients to achieve the same concept and work in imaging. Echoplanar imaging requires high magnetic field machines, and the gradients are significantly stressed during imaging, which slightly affects the artifacts. This is the echoplanar imaging that I am referring to regarding the provision. Thank you very much, and peace be upon you and the mercy of God. Here, we are also sitting together, just like before we gather in it. This is the dynamic substability contrast with fusion imaging. For example, if you take different voxels, this voxel, and this one at a certain short time, and this one at, say, 20 seconds, and this one at 3 seconds, here each voxel represents the change in signal intensity over time. This is the shape of the curve, and this voxel, the green one I took, because the loss here is very high. Here, for example, a little less, forget them. And these three are distinguished after washout. And this is during your washout of the contrast agent, or during the contrast agent. Originally, it was not present. What happened to the signal in the two scenes? As you can see, and this shows the contrast. The same applies. For example, in a case of stroke, it provides a hyper signal in diffusion and gives a hyper signal in the ADC. So you want to see the perfusion or the hemodynamics present in the image in the area that is nourished concerning the contrast or the stroke. Therefore, here also, there is signal loss. So you want to see the perfusion or the hemodynamics that you have present in the image in the area that is nourished concerning the contrast or your stroke. So here also, signal loss is evident in this area or in the area containing the stroke. And the same applies here. There is also a gene present here. If you use a focus on the lesion and see what happens, the signal will appear to you, as you see in this area. This is a case, for example, that has a neoplasm, and you can identify the cerebral blood volume in this area. Everything in this area has a specific management from a diagnostic perspective, whether it is transit time, or cerebral blood volume, or the time to be. It can also perform T1 pre-contrast imaging, which means it provides you with a hypersignal if you have a region present, for example, like the breast or thigh. It does the same thing and takes a view of this area, showing that there is a hypersignal or an increase in your signal or in the signal intensity present. This is called T1 pre-contrast imaging, and in this case, you rely on T1 and not on T2. تمام؟